Forget everything you think you know about what just happened in the Strait of Hormuz yesterday. Because what the United States military is calling a tactical success, and what President Trump is celebrating as proof that American naval power can reopen the world's most critical energy choke point, is actually something completely different. It is a strategic failure dressed up in the language of accomplishment. And by the time I'm done walking you through the numbers and the operational reality, you are going to understand exactly why 6 sunken Iranian boats and 2 American flagged vessels making it through the strait does not add up to victory. Let me be absolutely clear about something before we go any further. I spent decades in military intelligence analyzing naval operations and asymmetric warfare doctrine. And what the United States just executed is tactically competent, but strategically irrelevant. The operation succeeded at what it attempted. 6 Iranian fast attack boats were destroyed. 2 merchant vessels transited the strait under American protection. But here is what nobody in the Pentagon briefing room is saying out loud. Before this war started, 120 ships per day moved through the Strait of Hormuz. Yesterday, under the full protection of more than 10,000 American military personnel, over a dozen warships, and dozens of aircraft, the United States managed to move 2 ships. 2 ships out of a pre-war flow of 120 per day. That is not freedom of navigation. That is a 98% reduction in global energy logistics disguised as operational progress. Now, let me explain what Project Freedom actually is. Project Freedom is the Trump administration's latest attempt to break Iran's de facto blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, a 21-mile-wide choke point through which approximately 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passed before the war began on February 28th. Iran closed the strait in retaliation for the joint U.S.-Israeli strikes that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Since then, commercial shipping has dropped to near zero. Oil prices have spiked, and despite a fragile ceasefire since April 8th, the strait remains functionally closed. Trump announced Project Freedom Sunday evening, promising American forces would begin guiding vessels through the strait Monday morning. U.S. Central Command reported that 2 American-flagged merchant vessels successfully transited under military protection. What they did not emphasize is the scale of resources required. More than 10,000 U.S. personnel, over a dozen warships, dozens of aircraft, all deployed to move 2 ships through a waterway that used to handle 120 ships per day without any military escort whatsoever. And here is the part that should alarm anyone paying attention. During that transit, American forces engaged and sank 6 Iranian fast attack boats attempting to interfere with the operation. The Pentagon is framing this as proof the operation works. But if you understand asymmetric naval warfare, you understand that those 6 boats were not Iran's attempt to stop Project Freedom. Those 6 boats were Iran's opening bid. In a cost exchange calculation, the United States cannot win. Let me walk you through the mathematics, because this is where the entire strategic foundation of Project Freedom collapses. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what I'm about to explain, the cost exchange dynamics of choke point naval warfare and why the United States cannot sustain this operation at any scale that matters, is something the mainstream media will not break down with this level of precision. Hit that subscribe button, because this channel exists to translate operational level military analysis into public understanding before the gap between what you're being told and what's actually happening produces decisions that nobody saw coming. An Iranian fast attack boat costs somewhere between $500,000 and $2 million. Let's use the higher estimate, $2 million. The United States destroyed 6 of them. That is $12 million in Iranian naval assets eliminated. Now let me tell you what the United States deployed to achieve that result. A guided missile destroyer costs approximately $1.8 billion to build and roughly $20 million per year to operate. The Naval Task Force supporting Project Freedom includes over a dozen warships. The operational cost of maintaining that force runs into tens of millions of dollars per day. The United States spent more money yesterday protecting 2 ships through the Strait of Hormuz than Iran has spent on its entire fast attack boat fleet in the past year. And Iran has hundreds of those boats distributed across dozens of coastal bases. They can be replaced faster than the United States can destroy them. That is not a sustainable model. That is a resource depletion strategy, and Iran is winning it. But if you thought the cost exchange problem was the worst part of this story, stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you about commercial confidence and why 2 successful transits mean almost nothing for reopening the strait is where this operation's strategic failure becomes undeniable. Shipping companies do not make decisions based on whether the U.S. Navy can sink Iranian boats. They make decisions based on risk assessment, insurance costs, and the probability their vessel will complete a transit without being damaged. Lloyd's of London and major maritime insurers had already declared the Strait of Hormuz a high-risk zone. Insurance premiums have increased by orders of magnitude. Yesterday's operation did nothing to change that calculation. Yes, 2 American flag vessels made it through under heavy escort, but the vast majority of commercial shipping is not American flagged. Those companies watched yesterday and saw the United States deploy massive resources to move 2 ships while sinking 6 Iranian boats in the process. That does not inspire confidence. That confirms the threat environment is real, that Iranian forces are actively contesting the strait, and that transiting involves exchanging fire with an adversary willing to attack civilian vessels. A former U.S. Navy captain who now works as a maritime analyst told CNN he expects ships willing to transit under American protection might grow to 20 or 30 per day if the operation continues without major incidents. Pre-war flow was 120 ships per day. The optimistic projection for Project Freedom is 20 to 30 ships per day. That is a 75% reduction even under the best case scenario. And Iran gets a vote. Iran does not need to stop every ship or sink American destroyers. Iran just needs to maintain a perception of risk high enough that commercial shipping companies and their insurers decide the strait is not worth the cost. You do not need to win firefights to win economic warfare. You just need to make the cost of doing business higher than your adversary can sustain. Let me tell you what else happened yesterday that the Pentagon briefing did not spend much time on. The United Arab Emirates came under attack for the first time since the ceasefire took effect. Iranian drones struck the Fujairah oil industry zone, causing a major fire and wounding 3 Indian nationals. Emirati air defenses engaged 15 missiles and 4 drones fired by Iran. Schools across the UAE announced they were shifting to remote learning for the rest of the week out of concern for student safety. The UAE is a key American ally in the region. It hosts U.S. military personnel. It has been coordinating with Washington throughout this crisis. And yesterday, while the United States was celebrating the successful transit of 2 ships through the Strait of Hormuz, Iran demonstrated that it retains the capability and the willingness to strike American allies in response to operations it views as violations of the ceasefire. That is the strategic picture. The United States achieved a tactical objective, moving 2 ships through a contested waterway, and in doing so triggered an escalation that brought an American ally under direct attack for the first time in weeks. That is not progress. That is trading tactical gains for strategic complications. Now, let me explain why this matters beyond just the immediate operation, because what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz is not a temporary crisis that ends when the ceasefire solidifies into a peace agreement. What is unfolding is a permanent shift in the global energy security architecture, and the United States does not have a plan for managing it. Before I continue, if you found this analysis valuable, share this video. Share it because the mainstream media is showing you Pentagon graphics and talking about tactical success. They are not showing you the cost exchange mathematics, the insurance industry assessments, or the long-term implications of a world where 20% of global oil flow is permanently contested. Both narratives exist. Only one determines what your energy prices look like 6 months from now. Hit that share button and make sure others understand the operational reality behind the headlines. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide in its narrowest point. The shipping lanes that run through it are even narrower, constrained by depth, navigation hazards, and the need to maintain separation between inbound and outbound traffic. Iran sits on the northern shore. It has coastal missile batteries, radar installations, and naval bases positioned to monitor and control every vessel that enters that strait. The geography fundamentally favors the defender. The United States, operating from the other side of the world, has to project power into that space, sustain it indefinitely, and convince commercial shipping companies that the protection it can provide is sufficient to justify the risk. That is an extraordinarily difficult operational problem, even without an adversary actively contesting it. With Iran demonstrating daily that it can and will attack vessels in the strait, it becomes functionally impossible at the scale required to restore pre-war shipping volumes. Here is what a sustainable solution would actually require. The United States would need to maintain a permanent naval presence in the strait large enough to escort every commercial vessel that wants to transit. At 120 ships per day, that is 5 ships per hour, around the clock, every day. Each convoy would require multiple warships for protection, air cover, and mine-clearing operations ahead of the transit. The personnel costs, the fuel consumption, the wear on equipment, the logistics of rotating forces in and out of theater, all of it adds up to an operational tempo that the U.S. Navy has not sustained since World War II. And that assumes Iran does not escalate. That assumes Iran continues using fast attack boats and drones rather than deploying the full range of anti-ship capabilities it possesses. The moment Iran decides to employ coastal missile batteries, submarines, or large-scale mine-laying operations, the cost and complexity of maintaining secure passage through the strait increases exponentially. The United States does not have the resources to sustain that kind of operation indefinitely while simultaneously maintaining commitments in Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and everywhere else American forces are deployed. And Iran knows it. Let me take you inside the strategic logic that is driving Iranian decision-making right now, because understanding what Iran is trying to achieve explains why Project Freedom cannot succeed on the terms the United States has defined. Iran is not trying to sink American warships. Iran is trying to make the Strait of Hormuz economically non-viable as a commercial shipping route until the United States agrees to lift the naval blockade that has been in place on Iranian ports since April 13th. This is a dual blockade scenario. The United States is blockading Iranian ports, preventing ships from delivering goods to or collecting exports from Iran. Iran is blockading the Strait of Hormuz, preventing the flow of energy exports from the entire Persian Gulf region to global markets. Both sides are inflicting economic damage, but the damage is not symmetrical. Iran's economy was already under severe sanctions before this war started. The additional economic pressure from the U.S. naval blockade is significant, but it is not existentially threatening to the Iranian government in the short term. The global economy, by contrast, depends on Persian Gulf oil and gas. A prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz creates supply shocks, price spikes, and strategic vulnerabilities for every energy importing nation in Europe and Asia. Iran is betting that the global economic pressure created by the closure of the strait will force the United States to negotiate on terms more favorable to Iran than the current situation allows. And every day that Project Freedom demonstrates the impossibility of reopening the strait at scale, that bet looks more credible. President Trump has made it clear that he views the naval blockade of Iran as leverage to force a deal. But leverage only works if the other side has more to lose than you do. Right now, the United States is losing commercial access to 20% of global oil flows. Iran is losing access to export revenue it was already struggling to access due to sanctions. The cost-benefit calculation does not favor Washington as clearly as the administration seems to believe. And here is where the domestic political dimension of this crisis starts to matter. Trump announced on April 21st that he was extending the ceasefire indefinitely to make room for diplomacy. Last week, he sent a letter to Congress stating that hostilities with Iran had terminated, that there had been no exchange of fire between U.S. and Iranian forces since April 7th. That letter was required under the War Powers Act because the conflict had reached the 60-day mark without congressional authorization. Yesterday's engagement, where U.S. forces sank 6 Iranian boats, directly contradicts that assertion. Hostilities have not terminated. Exchanges of fire are ongoing. And the operation that triggered those exchanges, Project Freedom, was ordered by the president without any new congressional authorization. That creates a legal and political problem that extends beyond the immediate operational questions. If Trump is arguing that the war is over to satisfy the War Powers Act deadline, but simultaneously ordering military operations that involve sinking Iranian vessels, Congress and the public deserve clarity about what the actual status of this conflict is. Are we at war? Are we in a ceasefire? Are we conducting freedom of navigation operations that happen to involve destroying Iranian boats? The legal ambiguity is not accidental. It reflects the strategic ambiguity of a situation where neither side has achieved its objectives. Neither side is willing to concede, and both sides are conducting military operations that inch closer to full resumption of hostilities without anyone officially declaring that the ceasefire has collapsed. And that brings me to the most important thing I can tell you about where this situation is heading. The ceasefire is not holding because both sides want peace. The ceasefire is holding because both sides are using it to reposition, rearm, and prepare for the next phase. Iran is conserving its missile stockpiles. The United States is rotating forces and resupplying depleted interceptor inventories. Both sides are waiting for the other to make a mistake significant enough to justify resuming full-scale operations. Project Freedom might be that mistake. Not because it failed tactically, it did not. 2 ships made it through, 6 Iranian boats were sunk, but because it demonstrated that the United States cannot reopen the strait at any scale that matters without committing resources it cannot sustain and triggering escalations it cannot control. And the moment that becomes clear to the international shipping industry, to the insurance companies, and to the European and Asian governments that depend on Persian Gulf energy, the political pressure on Washington to find a diplomatic solution rather than a military one is going to become overwhelming. The United States just proved that it can move 2 ships through the Strait of Hormuz at a cost of tens of millions of dollars and the risk of reigniting a war that killed over 1,000 people in its first 6 weeks. That is not a victory. That is an advertisement for why this approach cannot work. If you've stayed with me through this entire analysis, you understand something that most people scrolling past Pentagon press releases do not. You understand that operational success and strategic success are not the same thing. You understand that 6 sunken boats and 2 escorted ships do not add up to freedom of navigation when the baseline requirement is 120 ships per day. And you understand that the real contest in the Strait of Hormuz is not between American destroyers and Iranian fast attack boats. It is between the cost the United States is willing to pay to keep that waterway open and the cost Iran is willing to impose to keep it closed. Subscribe to this channel because Project Freedom is not the end of this story. It is the beginning of a resource depletion contest that will define energy security and great power competition for the next decade. And I will be here to explain every phase of it with the same operational precision and strategic honesty. The Strait of Hormuz is not open. 6 Iranian boats are sunk. 2 American ships made it through. And the global energy supply shock that started on February 28th is not ending anytime soon. What comes next depends entirely on whether decision makers in Washington understand that tactical competence cannot substitute for strategic viability. The clock is running. The resources are finite. And the mathematics of choke point warfare do not care about press releases. Subscribe, share, pay attention, because this is the crisis that determines what the global economy looks like when the shooting stops.